Yeah, morning all. So my bandwidth is a bit low here, so I'll keep myself off video. But yeah, thanks for the introduction, guys. So I suppose what I'll be talking about today is some findings of our research in irrigation around the casino site, particularly casino in northern New South Wales. It was a sort of a heavy clay, deep vertical soil under bike shift irrigation. And I suppose one of the things we're looking at is particularly with this bike shift irrigation and the potential inefficiencies, which sort of Josh alluded to earlier. And not only that, but how do we basically combine our irrigation with nitrogen, but also taking into account rainfall. So obviously we are in quite a wet environment, and there are some sort of considerations there as well. So if I lag, just let me know and I'll try and catch up. And what is going on? So yeah, as Marguerite said, this sort of fits into this more profit from nitrogen program that we had a look at. There was three major uses, aspects of that. We sort of covered accounting for mineralization and enhanced efficiency fertilizers in the previous talks, but all these sort of things fit into this, the 4 R's of fertilizer management: right source, right rate, right time, and right place. Some of these, particularly the mineralization, are quite difficult. A lot of the factors are out of controls. We did talk about East Coast lows. Casino's certainly experiencing one at the moment. They've had over 100 millimeters in the last 24 hours. And so we would be seeing a lot of those sort of nitrogen loss issues that we mentioned there. We'd expect to see a huge flush of mineralization coming out of this rain event. So there might be a lot of nitrogen available, assuming it's not lost in subsequent rain events. I suppose one of the things about irrigation is it's one of the things we can control. And particularly alluding to what James said, and we look at these efficiencies and a lot of the aging infrastructure that's now, and what's the basically price point of moving to a new, more efficient irrigation system. So just quick summary of our nitrogen losses and basically why, what's driving them. So in terms of irrigation, there's two aspects there. First of all, if you're not putting enough water on, you're not utilizing the nitrogen that's in the system in the first place. What that does, it keeps it in the soil. It's not being lost as you irrigate, but as soon as you have an East Coast low come down like we have at the moment, then there is a potential of losing it. So not utilizing it during the irrigation growing period, you're basically accumulating in the soil, and where it can potentially be lost later. So optimizing your growth rates obviously is one way of reducing that potential risk. What also we get is if we over irrigate, or particularly in some of these older irrigation systems or inefficient irrigation systems, or just leaks, all these sort of areas where our soil becomes saturated. And as soon as our soils become saturated, and so what we see here is, first of all, on the left, what happens if we have a large rain event? We start to lose quite substantial amounts of nitrogen through this denitrification process. And that's going off as nitrogen N2, so what's basically most of the atmosphere, when you're looking at rates up to 5 kilograms per day. So it can become quite substantial quite quickly. And what drives that process is really just soil saturation. So the longer our soils are saturated, as we see on the right, our losses increase exponentially. So basically due to rainfall events, but also over irrigation, you can potentially lose quite a lot of nitrogen. And in one study we did there, we added 36 kilograms of nitrogen just as a standard rotation, and we lost 22 kilos of that over 21 days. So you can see it sort of adds up, and it can be quite high losses. So we did a irrigation study looking at what we can basically manipulate, and particularly the timing of the irrigation application in relation to these nitrogen losses and also nitrogen use efficiency in production. So it was all very experimental. So it's good to see James's work on the pivot scale of things. Ours is much more plot scale, and we're looking at theoretical thresholds, I suppose, more than the more practical ones that you'd see in the overhead stuff. But once again, it comes back to looking at your soil moisture and actually getting the data and looking at the data. So here we have our 3 plots of our high frequency irrigation, where we put it on every 4 days, and that was basically around 12 millimeters per application, and that was aimed at replacing evapotranspiration over that period in the Casino climate. We then looked at a higher rate, a medium rate over 10 days, and that was up to 41 millimeters. And that was basically replicating what the farmer was doing using his bike shift irrigation. So even though over the whole paddock he might be putting on an average what lower, on every single plot before he moved his bike shift, he was putting on about 40 millimeters. And then on the bottom plot, we were looking at what happens if we only irrigate every sort of 2 weeks. And once again, replacement for evapotranspiration for that was about 60 millimeters, increasing up to about 90 millimeters in the height of summer. So what we have, these are our soil moisture plots over the 12 months for the 3 different irrigation frequencies. And the red line is at 40 centimeters, the black line is at 10 centimeters, and our dotted line is basically field capacity. So that's basically, as James said, when the sponge is full, once it drains, what's left in the sponge is your field capacity. And I suppose the take-home message is here, and if we think about this this readily available water, if you look at the red line in particular, you can start to see, first of all, what depths the ryegrass and kikuyu both are taking the water from, and also as it starts to hit this sort of it's still extracting water, but it's really struggling as you go below that plant available water. I suppose a good example of that is right here in this sort of medium frequency one, right at the beginning. So as we get into the 40 centimeter one, well, you see straight away that in the 10 centimeter one, this fast drop here, when it goes down really quick, that's sort of the ryegrass in that case is accessing the plant available water, the readily available water. But as soon as it sort of flattens off, that curve flattens off there, that's really starting to struggle to basically take up that additional water, and it starts to deplete the next layer down. So it starts to then suck it out of the 40 centimeter layer, which, as you can see, even to getting towards that end of that period there, is also flattening off. So even though we're putting that on every 10 days, in this particular period of time, it would probably actually drop below that readily available water. Whereas in our high frequency irrigation, we rarely actually we're utilizing the water from 40 centimeters, and our plots were nice and steep, and so we're always in that sort of readily available water content zone, except for a few periods when our irrigation broke down. So I suppose the main point of that message is you can really start to see when the plants struggle to take up water and they need to suck it up from extra depth, and that's when our growth rates start to reduce. The counterpoint to that is what happens with rainfall, and that's what happened in this sort of middle period here from November to January, where we had a lot of rainfall, and you can see pretty much during this time both lines are over that field capacity. And so once we're above field capacity for extended periods of time, that's when we potentially run the risk of losing nitrogen through our denitrification gaseous loss processes. So we did exceed that line much more often in the high frequency, but because they were only for such short bursts, it wasn't so much of an issue. And it was only really in this big rain event during summer where we had these sort of plateaus where we started to see some pretty significant losses of nitrogen. And if we look at the annual losses here, these graphs on the right, they're a bit small to see on the units, apologies for that, but we're looking at the different columns on the top graph are the different nitrogen loss rates for the 3 different irrigation treatments. So we actually saw very little differences in our losses. In fact, they're pretty much the same between the high frequency and the low frequency rate. So putting on more water, more frequency, we didn't see any increase in our losses. And so, our losses were pretty low actually. But as soon as we get into that high frequency, so as soon as we start to push the boundaries of that waterlogging, then we see there's a big jump in our nitrogen losses, and basically putting it on sort of every 14 days because we're really pushing the system and waterlogging the soil, our losses jumped by about 40%. So we really increased our denitrification under that system. But if you look on the bottom graph there, we saw very little difference in yield, with only a very marginal difference in the higher frequency, and that's relatively because the amount of nitrogen that we're actually saving, due to these losses, was actually quite small compared to the amount of nitrogen that's floating around the system, the amount of nitrogen that becomes available through mineralization and whatnot. And so there was actually, obviously an effect of adding fertilizer. So this low one here is actually from our zero nitrogen treatment. All the rest had sort of 300 kilograms of nitrogen, 380 kilograms of nitrogen. This last treatment over here, which was marginally higher, that was a sort of the non-limiting nitrogen rate. So there was a bit of an effect of nitrogen at the higher rates, but not a lot. So just to put some numbers on this, so this is not over the whole year, but this is just over the sort of the growing season. So putting on the irrigation sort of every 4 days, even though it was sort of minor compared to the nitrogen impact, we did actually see a little bit of a impact in the yields. So our yields were averaged 13.2 tonne versus 12.5 tonne in the other treatments. And so that's a marginal increase in yield, but still probably important. And that's also reflected in how much nitrogen the plants took up. So we're sort of taking up over 400 kilos, 440 kilos in the high frequency versus the other two treatments. Very little difference in our daily biomass growth, but this fourth line here, our nitrogen losses was probably the most important thing, when they actually reduced quite a lot under the high frequency and medium frequency. And as soon as we start to push that threshold, as soon as we exceed that the field capacity for extended periods of time by putting on the larger amounts of water, our losses increased quite substantially. So interestingly, another advantage that came out from using the higher frequency irrigation, so every 4 days compared to every 10 days for the medium frequency, was just the better scheduling you could afford to do by taking into account rainfall events. And so there are, we're still in a pretty wet rainfall zone around Castina. It's about 1,200 millimeters. And so better utilization of that rainfall events for your scheduling allows you to better use that. So with the lower frequency and the medium frequency, we're finding we're putting on, say, amount of water, 40 millimeters or so, and then you'd have a rain event sort of 5 days later. And so you don't see the full benefit of that because most of it's basically then pushed deeper into the profile. So we're looking at a maximum irrigation use efficiency of about 45 kilograms of dry matter per millimeter of water. And that's simply because we gave us a bit more flexibility to use those rainfall events. And if we look at then how that relates to our nitrogen loss per unit of water, so that was also much lower in the higher frequency. So it increased almost 4 or 5 fold under the higher frequency, had less water use efficiency and higher losses. So certainly putting it on the nitrogen, the water on at the high frequency had a bigger effect there. So that's basically how much nitrogen we lost per unit of water. So just in summary, we're sort of seeing small but significant losses of nitrogen, about 1 to 5 kilos every grazing cycle. And these are sort of happening, irregardless of irrigation. Obviously, we're seeing more if we put on more irrigation, but certainly between the medium and the low frequency rates, we're not seeing a huge amount of difference. When we get large rain events, these East Coast lows, that's when we start to really extrapolate our nitrogen losses. And the important thing there is if we're basically under irrigating, and so we're actually putting on more nitrogen than the plants can take because they're limited in water. Then we're accumulating that nitrogen in the soil, which can then be potentially lost during these big East Coast low events. The effect of soil type on the magnitude of losses is actually quite minor, and that was quite a surprising thing. So we're actually seeing similar loss magnitudes in sandier soils than we are in the casino soils, and that's mainly because it's sort of these losses that are happening from the surface soil, and that surface soil is still getting. However, obviously the good structure of a permanent pasture, and particularly at casino, so even though it was really heavy clay soil, it'd been under permanent pasture for a long time. There were lots of macropores through worms and roots and whatnot. So even though it was sort of a heavy clay, it was behaving much more like a loam as far as draining a lot. Obviously, if you're going into cropping soils, soils that are sodic or whatnot, then you're going to have much more issues with that sort of infiltration rates and whatnot. I suppose just summarising a few other nitrogen loss findings that we found in this project, particularly around urine patches. So obviously urine patches are an important source of nitrogen. We're basically excreting up to 700 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. However, despite this, in these heavy clay soils, our losses were quite small. So a lot of that nitrogen that's being excreted by the cattle is actually going back into the soil organic matter, going back into the pool, which potentially could be used later. In terms of nitrogen management in pastures, we should try and aim to maximize our soil aeration. So, obviously keeping it under pastures where you can, those good soil structure, good drainage, avoiding those waterlogging conditions makes a big difference for reducing your nitrogen losses in the soil. Basically, in summary of the irrigation work, the more frequent the irrigation, saved water and increased nitrogen irrigation use efficiency from 25 kilograms per millimeter of irrigation under the really high rate to 45 kilograms of dry matter per millimeter of irrigation every 4 days. And that's mainly because of this increase in flexibility due to the rain events. Obviously, and also making sure we're staying in that readily available water zone. The counter to that, of course, is that, and I suppose under some certain conditions, and particularly coming into water restrictions, if the cost of pumping water is expensive or water storage is running low, is that these soils do have a large capacity of storing water, which can potentially be utilized. So what we were seeing in the infrequent irrigation event, when we were putting on irrigation every 14 days, we were actually utilizing water down to 70 centimeters. So that's a store of water that potentially is there if it's needed. And of course, there's a lot of potential nitrogen down there as well. It's getting washed down every time you have these big rain events, and it's accumulating low in the profile. So under some circumstances, that might be a useful resource to utilize. And just in summary, so we're basically seeing an exponential increase of denitrification, or basically nitrogen losses, as our soils become saturated. Major losses are triggered by repeated rainfall, waterlogging for greater than 2 days. So whether that's from irrigation or over irrigation, or leaking irrigation, inefficient irrigation, or rainfall. We also see large losses following intense rainfall events during dry periods, and potentially during the ryegrass establishment if you have a wet winter, wet autumn, when basically there's not a lot of root activity to take up the nitrogen. But in summary, I suppose if irrigation equals evapotranspiration, so if your scheduling's right, you're not over irrigating, our losses from nitrogen remain low, and it's really then just about staying within that readily available water content range, so that basically the plants don't become aren't stressing to get that additional water.
Great. Thanks, Dave. To see that relationship between the high frequency and low frequency is really important, and also, of course, around the amounts So we did have a question there from Josh, who just wanted to confirm at the high frequency, what was the rate? So you did talk about up to 80 millimetres, but was that in the high frequency treatment?
So in the high, so that's when we were putting it on basically every 4 days. We were just aiming to replace ET, evapotranspiration. So in the winter time, I think it was about 8 mils per application, and in the summertime that pushed out to about 16. So on average, it was around 12. So that was basically whatever the evapotranspiration was over 4 days, and then it was just intervals of that for every 10 days and every 15 days for the medium and the low treatments.
James, what irrigation scheduling systems have been adopted? How many, with centre pivots you've got down there, and how frequent are they across a paddock when you've got such big differences in soil types like we would at Tokel?
So typically here under our pasture-based systems with pivots, we'd have farmers applying anywhere between about 6 millimetres and 12 millimetres in an application. So 6 millimetres that'd typically be applied just about every day. You basically turn the pivot on and you leave it running, particularly if your system capacity is only that 6 to 7 mils. For others, they might put on 12 mils at a time, so they might put it on over 2 days. So basically, they run it around at a slower pace if you've got a lower capacity system, and put it on 12 mils at a time, but it takes 2 days to get back, and they'll just keep that going. For those with a higher capacity system, some systems are up to 12 mils. They might be watering every second or third day. But basically, the systems down here are designed such that once you get into summer, so beyond the end of December, where you don't have your rainfall, because we basically get very little, you just turn it on and you forget it. So you just run it. If you come to a rain event, you leave it running until you have about 10 mils and then you turn it off. That's basically the way that farmers more and more are doing their irrigation now, particularly under your high pressurized pivot type systems.
Thanks. So what about their soil moisture monitoring? Are they?
Yeah, so more and more farmers are taking it up, probably as a result of the work that we've been doing down here. They'll put usually 1 or 2 in to give them particularly an indication of when to start up as you come into the season, because that's really key. And so more and more farmers are doing that. They're also starting to use a water budgeting system, or at least a regular access to your evapotranspiration data. So a lot of them are linked up to what we call the SWAN email, where they get that regularly into their email, or we give a weekly report that goes out to a lot of our farmers here with a lot of the information on it. But essentially, they're just keeping an eye on evapotranspiration. So the main way that farmers will be scheduling is keeping an eye on evapotranspiration and rainfall, and then looking at that week forecast that's ahead and saying, okay, we're going to lose about 35 mils in evapotranspiration. Doesn't look like there's any rain coming. We're going to have to be watering flat out, or using that sort of mentality around keeping their water up. That's probably the key way they do it. There are a couple of tools that we're testing. So Swan have their own commercial system, which is more than a water budget, but Erie Pastures is another one. So there are tools that are being examined, but farmers tend to be using evapotranspiration as their key, and with some soil moisture probes to help to support what's going on underground.
So certainly, I think even though our systems are a little bit different, there's certainly we can use the information that the Tasmania and the broader Smart Irrigation project in relation to our systems here. Not forgetting that a couple of those sites are in on the Hunter at Tokel, and also we have Corokai and the Vega site as well. So all of that information will be coming out over the next couple of years or so that will be better informing our farming systems along the New South Wales coast. Luke, great to see your face there. Have you got a question? Go for it.
I don't know if it's so much of a question, Marguerite, but probably mimicking what was said, that's what we've found. We've got a centre pivot, bike shift, fixed sprinklers, a travelling irrigator, and K-line. And each system has its benefits and failures, and definitely the bike shift, because it's a 9-shift system, that it's pretty hard to get more than 2 shifts a day if you're going to put some substantial amounts on. So yeah, we find because our pump runs several different systems that when we get to summer, a lot of the time we'll just leave the pivot and let it keep going with sorghum and kikuyu under it. And then, yeah, we just get to a time when we know we're probably not going to be able to get enough on. The flip side, of course, is what's just happened now. And we've had 125 mils in the last couple of days and probably another half an inch overnight this morning. So we were irrigating up until a few days ago when this was predicted. But the trouble is, how do you stop your irrigation on a whim, I suppose? Once we get 80, 90% predicted rain for 3 or 4 consecutive days, we'll probably stop. But yeah, that's probably the hardest bit, is knowing when to stop before a rain event, because you just don't know what could happen, and this low could come down and we could see another 300 or 400 millimetres. Hopefully it'll push out by the time it gets to Coffs Harbour. But yeah, that's probably the points I picked up. And yeah, I think it's been a pretty good course, and some of the nitrogen stuff, the losses, and it sort of added up a bit of sense why paddocks wouldn't perform after they've been so wet, etc. So yeah, well done.
Fantastic, Luke. And I think your comments around knowing whether those forecasted, East Coast lows or whatever we call the what, it's going to eventuate or not, is the balancing act that we always have. Is it, do we turn everything off and rely that it's going to come through or not? And
yeah, that's right. And so I suppose that was one of the aspects we were looking at in that trial that we did, where if weather forecasting ever gets to the point where you can actually trust it, are we better off? Wait a second, we don't want our soils becoming waterlogged. We have a fair bit of capacity in our soils to store water. Is that a utilisable, resource? I suppose, overall, putting up more irrigation on, more frequency, just overrode that sort of potential benefit. So, these are sort of some of the compromises I suppose we have to take.
Yeah, there's not going to be there's not one answer. It is a balancing act, and yeah. So it's I guess it goes back to some of that stuff that Richard was talking about last time, around that balancing the risk in that risk scenario. Pete, did you have something to say on that?
Well, I think it's really important. Like, I've read a few papers from BOM and CSIRO that East Coast lows are very hard to predict. They can come at any time of year. The further south we go, they're more likely to come in winter. But it's always going to be, in terms of, we can get a good indication a few days out, but we never really know where they're going to land and how heavy it's going to be. And so they're always going to be a wild card in our system, and we've just got to get to understand that and work with it, unfortunately. But yeah, they say it's very hard for them to accurately model when an East Coast low is going to eventuate or predict it. And yeah, obviously they'll get better, but it's still going to be difficult.
Just a comment on depth of irrigation. Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, look, Matt, all you can do is increase your soil structure. And so, when these big rain events come through, your soil's draining, and, that's about all you can really do under these sort of unpredictable systems. But, yeah.
Yeah, just in terms of deficit irrigation, obviously, deficit irrigation is about trying to predict and use rainfall as much as you can, as an example. So making sure you switch off before. But if the prediction is not very robust, then our biggest concern, particularly down here where our system capacities aren't very good, is that we constantly get ourselves in a green drought scenario. And when you've got 150 to 200 mils, if you've had a deficit of 30 mils, well, it's not going to be much, and it'll be filled and overflowing anyway in those massive systems. So there's not a lot you can really do around those 150, 200 mil systems that come in. But we tend not to advise people down here, at least in these temperate areas, to do deficit irrigate during our January, February period, because it's too dangerous in terms of the ability to get stuck in an under-irrigated situation.
No, I think you know, one thing that Luke really raised, and I know he's been raised a lot through the 4 webinars, is around the flexibility of our of the design of our irrigation systems along the coast. We have these multitude of irrigation systems like pipe shift and K-line and you know, high pressure pivots, and then it's like, you know, maybe over time we really need to look at how we can best turn those on and off and just make them, I guess, more ready and user friendly for that strategic irrigation requirement. It's a really hard one, and I think it's the multitude of systems that we have isn't really reflected in other areas of the industry in Tasmania or Victoria and South Australia. So it is quite unique to us. And I think it's something longer term to get irrigation more right and scheduling right. We need to sort of have a think about the flexibility and design of our systems. So it is a lot. It's a long-term thinking thing that I think we have to put some time and effort into. So thanks once again, everyone. Again, we thank Hunter Local Land Services for supporting or actually running this project. And we also thank Queensland University of Technology for David's input, University of Tasmania or Tasmania Institute of Agriculture for James' input, and the University of Melbourne for Richard Eckhart's input. And the Department of Agriculture, Environment, Water and Environment through both the More Profitable Nitrogen program and also the Smarter Irrigation for Profit program as well. So thanks again, everyone, and we will probably most likely follow up with a couple of shorter webinars on just some specific topics that have come out of these ones in 2021.